Hello, I'm Sean Fleming. I'm the Deputy Director of the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council, and I have a couple of special education directors and supervisors to talk about changes that IEP teams will have to make, and we're going to talk about some considerations for the first 30 days going into the 2014-15 school year as it relates to the new changes for alternative pathways to promotion and graduation, and considerations for after the first 30 days and why some things should be done, and also what they're doing to monitor themselves and to hold themselves to high standards so that IEP teams are having performance requirements that have rigorous and attainable goals for kids and meaningful goals, and what they're doing towards that end. So let's just talk about the first 30 days. And we've discussed this a lot between special education directors and some advocates about the need to not have an entire IEP for kids. And so let's start off with, you have kids who you think are eligible, you've targeted. In this school year, it's a lot of high school, and some kids going into high school, who didn't pass the standardized test or didn't meet state benchmarks or district's requirements for promotion for a couple of years if it's promotion, and for graduation for the last year if it's promotion. So when you have that IEP team, they're going to have to make a couple of decisions. One, if the kid is eligible, do they want to take this pathway? And then if they do, they're going to have to make some quick decisions about amending the IEP. So let's just start off with the logic of why, and Bridget, I'd like you to start. What are some reasons to not change the whole IEP for every kid who's on an alternative pathway in the first 30 days?
Well, the first thing we have to consider is that timeline, that 30 days that we're working with. That's a quick turnover time at the beginning of school. So we really want to target, which students do really qualify. And the reason you'd want to amend the IEP is because you want to make sure that you're making decisions and having it on the IEP so that we're following the law within that meeting in that 30 days. Mm-hmm. But also that we're going to be doing quite a few IEPs in that first 30 days. So we want to make sure that we are not overwhelming ourselves as school systems with having too many IEPs that are going to come due the following school year.
Or for every school year hereafter. Right. So I guess the logic is if you have the IEP in the first 30 days for all these kids and you keep doing that every year, then at the beginning of every school year, y'all would be looking at almost a lot of kids, IEPs due in the first 30 days when you have a lot of other things, just a few other things to get accomplished.
Right, so that's why you'd want to look at amending IEPs within those 30 days as opposed to having that full IEP meeting.
Okay, good. Charlie, do you have anything other rationale for that?
No, it's pretty much the same thing, but there's a couple of issues with if you don't amend it, if you don't mind me going into that. If you go with a full annual IEP, it's problematic not only because all of those IEPs that we're doing this year are going to come due at the same time within that 30-day window for the rest of eternity as long as the child's enrolled, but also every year from now on we're going to have more and more students that we're going to be targeting because we'll have to be addressing that for every student. So every IEP conceivably could come due within the first 30 days of school, and that is a logistical impossibility. So the options that we would be left with are not being in compliance with the law, or not providing the opportunity for an alternate pathway to graduation or diploma, or being out of compliance. None of those are acceptable. So we would have to be very careful and go with the amendment process, which is legitimate, and provides us the opportunity to continue with what we're doing and maintain timelines. Another problem with having all these IEPs come due in this part of the state, in this part of the country, is if they're all due the first month of school, well, we have hurricanes that come up. And with hurricanes come loss of power, loss of internet access. So again, it poses problems on a huge level when there are many other things that we'll be needing to do at the same time.
But I think we also want to consider when is that annual IEP due date, because if it's, October 1st, then you might want to consider having that full
That's correct.
IEP meeting, because then in just a few more weeks you would have to have another meeting anyway. So we want to do things that make sense.
That's correct.
For meeting the needs of our kids.
So to be clear, you have some kids, for some students, the IEP team may meet and say he is eligible, but we don't agree with having an alternative pathway. They might be very close to meeting, the standard benchmarks and criteria, but then when they do, they'll have to make some changes. So they have to establish performance requirements. And for this year, we know, the easiest way to think of that is how they performed on tests, et cetera, that have been required to be promoted or to, earn Carnegie units or to towards graduation. So have y'all thought of anything for IEP teams in terms of what would you look at for a score? Because one example was a young gentleman who testified. I think he needed like a 640 on his math end of course test, and he got a 620. I'm just thinking he met all the other course requirements, and will they have to require him to meet a 640 again, or was 620 reasonably enough proficiency level for that teacher, and considering the student's disability and how that might factor into that test score, to where they might even say a 600 or a 620 again, something that would still require the student to try to do, to have to care about what the test is. Have y'all thought of any guidance for any teams to think of that?
Yeah.
Because I know it's going to be an individualized thing for
Correct.
sure. That's the first thing, and we can't make up everything, but it's a very complicated thing, and we look at further guidance. But I don't know if y'all thought about that or have any suggestions.
I think that the first thing we always need to do is look at students' past performance.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what have they done on previous tests. We have, we all know that schools have lots of data on kids, lots of information. And so individualizing for each student is what's the most important thing to do. What has this student done on high-stakes tests and standardized tests in the past, and what's a reasonable expectation for this child to be able to achieve, and know that he is still able to earn his Carnegie units and be on this pathway for a diploma.
Okay.
And remembering that testing is only one criterion
Correct.
that we're using to determine the alternate pathway eligibility. So I would want the IEP teams to be looking at other ways that the student has demonstrated knowledge of the content area or the skills. Because if a student is just a poor test taker,
Right.
but they're doing their algebra, they're doing their 6th grade math, whatever the deal is, they just can't pass that test. My opinion, and this is what I would share with the principals, the ODRs, the teachers, and all the members of the IP team, is if the student has demonstrated mastery or proficiency in the skill or content area, then is that not in fact what the outcome is that we're looking for? So if we get that proficiency demonstrated in multiple arenas, then I think we use that as an IP team, and that's what justifies a lower score or no score, depending on the child.
Exactly, because we know that the research shows that using portfolios and using project-based learning and all of those things, there's lots of research to support the use of that in making decisions on whether or not the student can do what it is we expect them to do.
Can demonstrate their proficiency.
That's correct.
Exactly.
Right. I've also heard that school districts across the state have a lot of variance and differences between how kids are promoted and how kids earn Carnegie units or meet the requirements. And I've also heard from some districts where they passed the end of course test, they passed the LEAP, but they didn't pass the course. Like the teacher, this is how I'll phrase it to one teacher I met who her child, aced the LEAP, but failed the class. I said, you obviously teach very well, but you score really hard. And so I wonder if y'all have any suggestions for, educators and parents in the school districts where the child is demonstrating proficiency, where in another part of the state it would be, and I think, Charlie, you brought this up in terms of some sort of uniformity and that's what these standardized tests are trying to do, and provide some ability to compare apples to apples. But to some degree, but it's, what would your suggestion be to an educator or a parent in a school system where it's the course requirements have gotten so rigid that the child's actually demonstrating proficiency in the course tests, but not in the course is seeming to look. I think Bridget, you brought up portfolio assessments and other things. Maybe they're not having flexibility there, but I don't know if y'all have any thoughts on or suggestions with that.
I mean, one of the things, and I'm a stickler with this, if in fact the assessment is geared toward, is aligned with the curriculum, and our job is to make sure that each student demonstrates proficiency in that curriculum, they're doing that. Mm-hmm. So if the course itself is the obstacle to that student's meeting the criterion, then I suggest that we look at the standards and the strands within that course and see if the student is actually meeting it, because it might be that they're meeting the content standards but not meeting possibly another component, a writing standard or whatever, but they're meeting the writing standard in some other class. So we want to look at it very holistically to see if, as a whole, is this student, is he a marketable citizen? Mm-hmm. Are we teaching him how to learn?
Right.
Have we taught him how to demonstrate mastery? And then we go with that, and it might look very differently for you as it would for you or for me.
Right.
So how would that look on an amended IEP, for example? What would your suggestion be if you have a quick thought of what that would look like to an IEP team?
Well, the IEP team could look at some of the things and perhaps delineate the specific strands or
of what would be
standards.
Required for the
That's
student
right.
to perform within the
what
course
are
content.
what are the essential learning elements that this child must demonstrate mastery on? And then you can look, like you said, you always want to look at what they've done in the past. They may have already done it on some, but if they haven't on all that the IEP team determined to be appropriate, well then you've just now set up an intervention process for that student. And it's very laser focused, so it doesn't waste the student's time or the teacher's time in the area of instruction.
Yeah, and I think that's what we really need to look at, going back to the individual student. What can they do, and what is our goal in all of this? Our goal is to graduate employable citizens who are able to, participate in their communities. And so I think that really is our ultimate goal. And how do we get kids there? What is the alternative? The alternative is them dropping out of school, and we definitely don't want that to be the path that they take. We want to offer them a path that leads them to success in being adults who can be part of their communities.
Okay, thanks. And there's been some discussion of, I guess, quality control or oversight, and trying to make sure everybody's doing it right. And that's a challenge, particularly when there's a whole new shift in how things are done, and you're going to try and train everybody in the front end and trying to educate, and we're trying to share a little bit of information here and some other ways to guide this. But y'all have discussed, and other people have discussed, how y'all plan to go through and look at what IEP teams have decided, so that you might provide guidance in the future, but maybe even go back and ask them some questions, while still respecting the fact that it's an IEP team decision, and for a lot of reasons it needs to be their decision, not an administrative decision. But then, as an administrator, you're responsible to make sure that they're having the appropriate considerations. And so, why don't you talk a little bit about what y'all are doing for that quality control and quality, management of this?
Well, I think one of the things that we have in place is that we have some checks and balances up front, that we actually have some special ed representatives that are embedded in schools, that are part of our district team, that are there to be a part of teams and be a part of the decision making up front, and monitoring what's coming out of the schools, and also making sure the information is getting to the schools. So having that checks and balances is something that we have in place, and moving forward we're going to use some of the things that we already have in place, and then from there, once those IEPs are completed, that we're monitoring individual schools and individual grade levels, and making sure that what's happening is appropriate for students, and that there's not an over-identification or an under-identification of the kids who qualify for this pathway.
And so, you know, as it pertains to, say, the changes in the IEP, you know, because we discussed a lot about not wanting to lower standards for kids, and so I'm assuming y'all be looking at making sure they're not just lowering all the standards below, I guess, what would, I guess the data would seem to suggest where a kid should be expected to perform and demonstrate their proficiency. I'm assuming y'all have some sort of...
Right, we are going to, you know, making sure they're accessing the general curriculum to the level that individually the students can, and making sure that that famous word rigor is there, making sure that it's rigorous but attainable for those students. I think that's where we really need to make sure that whatever performance standards we have on these IEPs, that we are not lowering the bar for our kids at all, that we're always holding them to meeting an attainable level of performance that's meeting their individual needs.
Okay.
And in this very early stage of discussion, because this is very brand new.
Yeah.
So what we've had in my leadership team, what we've had discussion about is what we want to do to make sure that we honor the intent of this Act 833, the letter and the intent of IDEA. This is an IEP committee decision, but what I want to do is make sure that we're using it consistently throughout the district, same criteria as it's appropriate for individuals. So what we're going to do, in theory, at this point, we're going to pull, about at the semester, we're going to pull all the IEPs that have addressed changing the promotion criteria or the graduation criteria, and look to see what the data were that were used to create those criteria, and to help that child to be eligible for this alternate pathway. We're not going to do this in a punitive manner, but we want to look to see if we see patterns of erroneous actions, because we want to go through it if it's a particular school, or if it's a particular IEP team, or if it's a particular, like, is it elementary, is it middle, is it high school, so that we can provide professional development to get some continuity throughout the district. Because while I think it's extremely important that we are continuous throughout the district, because we don't want to see movement of children from one school to another, I'm hoping that through some venues like this, we can garner some sort of continuity throughout the state, so we don't see districts losing students to go to another district that is perceived to have less rigorous standards. So that's kind of what we're going to do, but we're going to take care of us first, and then work with the state.
And you know, one thing that a lot of special education directors have indicated, you know, this is just a very general overview or discussion, but to provide some case studies and sort of what, you know, Charlie and Bridget have indicated, is take some of the examples, and I think they will get more complex as the years go on, to provide guidance and to look at what decisions maybe we, you know, playing Monday morning quarterback, or, you know, looking in hindsight, is saying, well, maybe that probably wasn't the best consideration, but you know, not faulting that IEP team necessarily this year, but learning from it. And what we do intend to do through the course of this is have some case studies of different types of examples of different types of students, different grade levels, etc., to provide more guidance in terms of what things IEP teams should look at and consider in amending and changing the IEPs. Now, after the first 30 days, you know, we see this as just sort of being part of the IEP process, where, and, you know, I see y'all shaking your heads, and so it's, you know, determining whether the kid's eligible. I mean, there'll be some easy indicators of that, and if the kid is eligible, again, the IEP team making the determination, do they think it's appropriate for an alternative pathway? Is it necessary? In a lot of districts, I've heard for promotion, it's not even it's not a problem, particularly at most grade levels. But as high stakes, you know, shifts, and it always shifts. Historically, it has gone from one end to the other, but to be prepared for any student through the IEP process to determine whether they're eligible and whether they need to be on an alternative pathway, and certainly by the time they get to high school, is to have clear direction for that. And so I'm assuming, you know, after the first 30 days, and you're saying look at all the kids who, you know, you said the first semester, I'm saying like around Christmas-ish, you know, beginning of next school year, y'all going to have pulled all the IEPs from the first 30 days, realizing y'all going to have continued IEPs meeting through the school year as well. with these decisions being made. And so do y'all have any guidance for those when they're setting up and looking at, I think people start looking at IEP goals differently. I just think even developing them, realizing that some of those IEP goals can be considered for promotion or graduation. I do want to make it clear that like a kid's behavioral things on an IEP, they cannot be excluded from promotion or graduation because they didn't meet some behavioral goal. And some people have asked that question. I just want to make that clear in this conversation. But do y'all see differences in how people start even looking at IEP goals and moving forward?
I see that we're going to have to be a lot more laser focused on it if we want to make this work. I also see that this law is law, and the wording is never going to change until the law is repealed or a new law supersedes it. But our implementation of it, I think, is going to continue to improve because we're going to learn throughout the whole process. So from that standpoint, I think what you're talking about, changing the way we actually look at goals and objectives, is going to be a result of this law, and I want us to keep doing that. But I also think one of the things that we do as a profession, we all. How many times do you hear the expression, "If I'm going to make a mistake, I want to err on the side of the child"?
Yeah.
I think if I want, and I say it all the time because I believe it. But sometimes I think we're not quite sure what the side of the child is. I think we need to look at this and keep in mind that sometimes saying no is on the better side of the child. It's for the best interest of that child. And sometimes not reducing the standards is what they need, because that would feed into the fears of us lowering the expectations. And sometimes we do the wrong thing for the right reasons.
Yeah.
We need to be sure that we're on the same page and we're doing the right thing for the right reason.
And I think you that's a great point. I think you're going back to even the decision about whether to choose an alternative pathway. Just because a kid didn't pass one end of course test, even twice, do you put them on a pathway? And the answer is not necessarily, certainly not necessarily. And we really want people to have that be all these things be individualized. But for a lot of kids, and even the kid I mentioned earlier who scored a 620, the IP team may meet and say, you know what, he's got me a 640. We think he can do it and he should do it, and it's not going to prevent him from having a diploma. But I think in this first school year, if y'all get to the point of the kid's not going to graduate with a diploma because he's 20 points off of one test, that's clearly needs to be adjusted.
Well, we need to know, why is he 20 points off? Because it's one thing if his disability is impeding his progress in instruction or assessment, but it's another thing if it's the morning before the test, his dad rolled over the dog and killed the dog on the kid's way to school, but because the parents are so dedicated, they sent the child to take the test. Well, the kid was not in a real good testing frame of mind. So that 620 is vastly different from a child who has a significant learning disability and is having trouble just comprehending what he's reading. Two different results, the same result, two different courses of action.
Or I've heard of one example where a girl has passed the course requirements but didn't meet the end of course test 7 times, same class. And it's like, at some point, if she's doing all these other things and she's very close to where it is anyway, are we going to send her out to the world and tell everybody she's didn't meet any standard? And so,
and I think that very example exemplifies why this act is a good thing, because now we have data that we've always had, but we don't have to ignore it anymore.
Yeah. And also, as you were talking, I'm thinking, they may be able to pass an English EOC test, but not a math EOC test or algebra. So we want to make sure that we're making the decisions based on, which courses they really need this for, and not across the board say they get it in, for everything. We really need to make sure that we are doing this the right way, because we have this opportunity with this law to get it right. I think we all need to make sure that what we're doing is really meeting the needs of the kids.
And so with that, I'll just close with IP teams. They're going to have a significant challenge, particularly at the beginning of this next school year, and thereafter, because one of the changes is it's not done after the fact. What we used to do is say, let's have the kids, decide whether they get promoted either by age. When they're 12, you get out of 4th grade. When you're 16, you get out of 8th grade. Or, you have some waiver that's after the fact, or a school building level committee that's after the fact. And what this does is significant changes. These amendments to these IEPs and these IEPs from here on out will be establishing criteria that some students will have to meet to be promoted or to graduate. So they'll still have those requirements, and we just want to make sure they maintain the high, rigorous, and attainable goals for that student, and do it on the best, like Charlie said, what's best for the student, which may be complicated to identify all the time.
And I really think that we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, like you said, this is a learning curve for everyone. We don't know what these performance standards are supposed to look like. We're just going to have to make the best decisions, whether, what is that score that we think this child can make. No one has a crystal ball, but we really just have to make professional, educated decisions based on what we know about the child. And school systems are going to be looking for some guidance on what does this look like on the actual IEP, because that's what we're talking about here.
Right.
What does that goal look like, and what is an appropriate wording for that goal? We're gonna be figuring that out over the first 30 days of the school year.
And forever after.
Yes.
So I appreciate y'all time today and all the time y'all have taken to try and do this, and we'll continue working on making it right. Thank y'all.
Thank you.